Hi, we continue in 1 Kings 1 today as Nathan has advised Bathsheba to talk to David to save her life and the life of her son Solomon. And as we saw in the last video, there's some real questions about why her son and her life is at risk, given that when Solomon does take care of Adonijah later in chapter 2, Haggith's life is not said to be at risk for any reason we know. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes, and that's what we're trying to ferret out here as we go through the story. So if you haven't watched my two videos introducing first the two books of 1st and 2nd Kings, and second introducing the two chapters we're on here, 1 Kings 1 and 2, I really encourage you to do so. In the second one, we go over these questions you see on the right side of the screen, and now we've been exploring these right here. The role of Nathan, both here and earlier in relation to Solomon and Bathsheba, the Nathan-Bathsheba approach to David, which we're right in the middle of, and David's state of mind and capacity, and we'll get to these when we look at the scene that follows. And it's a real question because the text has shown us from the very beginning of the chapter, and I won't look at it all right now, that Abishag was brought to him because he was old, advanced in years, and could not get warm, which is generally understood as an expression of the end of his male virility. And there are also a sequence of things which he doesn't know. He didn't know Abishag sexually, but he apparently doesn't know about Adonijah's rebellion. But as we've been exploring, is that realistic? Does he not know because other people think he doesn't know, as Bathsheba will tell him this time? Or does he know and he's just playing it the way David plays things, letting things unfold without revealing many of his cards? And we can't know for sure, but after this scene and the one that follows with Nathan, David will give a definitive answer to who will succeed him. So let's just jump right into our materials here. We're looking at these first two chapters of the succession, and as I was noting in the introductory video to the entire unit here, the story really changes radically after that. And that's really important for exploring why the two coalitions, the one that sides with Adonijah and the one that sides with Solomon, do what they do, which will answer a little bit more when we look at chapters 3 and 4, especially chapter 4, as the lineaments of his reign, of Solomon's reign, are more revealed. So as we look at our immediate scene here, this is what we saw last time, Nathan saying to Bathsheba, and now we have this paragraph. And I was noting that if we look up above, the Adonijah scene was very short. This is the entire Adonijah scene, and there's, other than him saying, I myself will rule, there's no dialogue. It's simply the narrator summarizing all this. And plainly the narrator is on the side of the winner, on the side of Solomon, sort of, because it depends on which narrator we mean, and that's one of the questions we've been exploring, is certainly the Solomon story was not written all at one time. There are some elements, especially chapter 11 and the beginning of chapter 2, as we'll see, that are very Deuteronomistic, using language that's very clearly from a much later period, from the time of Josiah, most likely in roughly the 630s BCE. So we have to keep exploring that as we go, whether we think the narrator is promoting Solomon or against Solomon. But in our initial scene, we see that the Adonijah claim to the throne is just summarized, whereas the story of getting Solomon on the throne takes up all this long territory and isn't answered until way down here. And there isn't all the dialogue we see and all the key words that we see so often repeated, my Lord the King, so many times, and the repeated phrase both in Bathsheba's statement and then in Nathan's statement, which we'll compare a little bit, your son Solomon shall succeed me as king, and he shall sit on my throne. And the role of repetition in this chapter is especially important in these dialogues because repetition not only is important for the reader to see, as we'll explore in this video, what happens when something is repeated with variation and what that tells us about intent and character, but also because so much is not filled in here and we have to try to fill it in to understand what's going on. And David doesn't seem to know, so repeating seems to make something more true if you say it over and over again. And we know that in current American politics, and we know it in a much longer trajectory in advertising, where if you just say it again and again, it'll start to seem true to people. Another way to look at this chapter, as we did last time, was to substitute the key words for the key names. And we see all the names here, so many people involved. And last time I also showed a chart, which I won't show again now. I posted it at radicalbible.net, where all these PDFs are posted, where I showed the actual meaning in English of these Hebrew names. Nathan, for example, meaning gift, and Solomon meaning peaceful. So it'd be very interesting to read the story again the way the original audience heard it, not as Nathan, but as gift. But that's going to be confusing for us, so I've left it here now, but know that that's posted at radicalbible.net. And so one thing I want to look at here especially is this chart. So we can see here's Nathan's instructions, here's Bathsheba's speech, and here's Nathan's speech that we'll look at next time. And the part that is in non-bold here is what Nathan says that is not repeated at all. And these are not actually instructions. This is just a framing word. The part that's red is the part that he told her to say and that she does say, and then is repeated again in Nathan's speech. But the black here, the bold black, is what he tells her to say, which he didn't say, and the bold black here is what she adds that he didn't say, whereas the green here and here is what she added that Nathan, listening in the wings, repeats. And plainly he heard what she was saying. He's certainly just outside the door and comes in immediately because, as he said, while you were still speaking, I will come in after you and confirm your words. So he obviously has to be within close earshot to know that she's still speaking. And as I was noting last time, the suggestion that she's still speaking suggests that he's expecting her to say more than just this, because by the time she started speaking, he'd have to already be on his way into the room. Whereas now that she adds 2 full sections, so there's 3 units here, so to speak, it's much more in depth and gives him more time to get there and more time for David to absorb what she's having to say before Nathan comes in. And whether he confirms it or whether he adds to it and changes it, we'll have to decide in the next video. So with that up there, let's just jump right into our scene as we begin in verse 15. And as I was noting last time, Bathsheba offers no questions or comments about Nathan's proposal here. This just happens immediately after this. So she doesn't say yes, she doesn't say no, she just does it. And when she goes in, we don't know if she's going to do what Nathan says or not. Does Nathan trust her? We know nothing about their relationship, except that it goes back to the time when David first took her from her husband Uriah and then eventually impregnated her with what became Solomon. So Bathsheba went to the king in his room. And the word for in his room here, hakadra, is the innermost private chamber. And we see it a couple of other times. We saw it in 2 Samuel. I won't go back to all those, but both of which involve stealthy violence. And another one there when David avoids acting violently to Saul, Yahweh's anointed, for fear that Yahweh's anointed will become him, and he doesn't want violence against him. So this isn't a very private space where violence isn't expected by the person in there, but a reader of the biblical stories might expect, wait a minute, when a king goes into his quiet room, sometimes referred to as the cool chamber perhaps, where one can relieve oneself, as King Ehud did in the book of Judges, someone coming in there is private. And yet, Abishag is there. And isn't that an interesting scene in many levels? I was noting that Abishag in terms of Chekhov's gun in the first scene where she's there, and she's only mentioned in passing here to highlight there's a witness. She's not important to the story yet, and she's still never going to speak, but she's potentially a witness here to speak to whom? We don't know who brought her there. As I noted in the very first scene, she was brought there simply by his slaves speaking as a group. There was nobody named who was responsible for the idea that Abishag should be sought or that she was the right one or that she should be there with him. But there she is, as you can see in this picture where Bathsheba has to speak to David with Abishag sitting there listening. And perhaps their descriptions in the text don't match this painting given the sensibilities of when this painting was made in a much later era. But there you see at least one artistic rendering of it. And it says she's attending the king, but as I was noting in the key words, and I can put that up here, she's serving the king. We don't know exactly how, and we don't know if that means she's standing there, or if she's in bed with him, or if he's in bed, given that the original description was that she was there to keep him warm. But none of that is said here. So, with that in mind, Bathsheba comes in and bows and does obeisance to the king. And keep in mind, this is her husband. This is the man who took her and got her pregnant twice, as far as we know. Maybe there's more that we don't know about, but there aren't any more children from them we've heard about. And she's treating him just like she's a member of the people that he is in charge of, that she has no special relationship with him at all. And she refers to him simply as my lord and my lord the king, like anybody else in his court would do. So whatever their actual intimacy might be, it's not here. There's no intimacy of language, and there's apparently no intimacy of physical space, given Abishag's presence seemingly in between them. So she's got to speak at a distance, and she has to speak in a way that Abishag can hear. And so here's how it goes. And the king responds with his first speech in the book, and it's really just one compound word in Hebrew, and it's a play on words. It's malak, which is very close to melech, which means king, and is certainly one of the key words we see throughout here. And it's as noun we see king, and as we saw Adonijah say earlier, I myself will rule, using the verb form of it, which is very similar. So I didn't highlight those as a key word because it's not exactly the same word, but it's even more times than we can see just on the purple highlighted words king there. So he says to her, Malak, and here's her response. My note below has Bathsheba's only direct speech, and it's Nathan's words, although she adds quite a few of her own. Although note someone like Baden's view, who argues that Nathan is, quote, a literary construct, and that this is all Bathsheba's initiative. And Baden argues that consistently, that Nathan appears in several key places to be a text category rather than a human category. We can't know that for sure any more than we can know that the entire story is a literary construct without real connection to much historical event, but that's at least his view. Beale notes the chiastic shape in these verses parallel to what I showed in inverse, what I showed in her note on verses 11 to 13, where there, when Nathan spoke to her, he framed it around her threatened life and put the question of the kingship in the middle. And now it's the opposite. Bathsheba reverses the chiasm of personal concerns and kingship. She begins and ends with the personal concerns, the oath made to her and her threatened life, as we can see, and places the kingship at the center of the chiasm. So an interesting little literary device reversing the elements of those in the two speeches. So she says, my Lord, addressing it that way. And notice not my Lord the King, even though it's what she says in the next verse, simply my Lord. And she claims this as a direct speech. And this is where I want to highlight the contrast with what he told her to say and what we have here. As Baden notes, David never could have said this. There is no evidence that David had any plans to remove Adonijah from the succession. That's based on the idea that there seems to be much evidence, although not explicitly, that David intended Adonijah to be his successor, based on the idea that all the men of Judah respond to the invitation from Adonijah and don't seem to have any sense that the king will be mad at them if they go do that, and all the king's sons, except Solomon, who wasn't invited, certainly because Adonijah must know that he has royal pretensions, or at least Nathan and Bathsheba might have royal pretensions for Solomon. And so there's much evidence that Adonijah thinks he's going to be king and is king, other than a few people who seem to side with Solomon, or at least not side with him so far. But we've not heard this for sure, and even Nathan didn't say that. He said to ask it as a rhetorical question, did you not swear? And she states that it's a positive statement. My Lord, you swore. Does she think she's lying? Does she think she's telling the truth? There's no way for us to know. Is she lying? I mean, is this true? Again, there's no way for us to know. And that's just the beauty of the ambiguity of the Hebrew Bible in general, but of this story altogether. Yet there just aren't obvious, clear good guys and bad guys and truth speakers and not truth speakers. Just like real life, and especially like real life amidst the fog of political propaganda and mixed motives. And having worked in the U.S. Senate myself, I can say that whether it's a speech from politicians you see on TV or on the internet, or what I saw behind the scenes, what people say and what they actually believe are almost never the exact same thing. So we have that here in our text. So she claims it explicitly. You swore to your servant or your slave by Yahweh. And Nathan didn't even dare to invite Yahweh. And so she's invoking the strongest possible response. Yes, you did this, and you did it by your God. Notice not my God, your God, saying, your son Solomon shall succeed me, saying to Bathsheba. So she's making it sound like you said this to me explicitly, not in general to the public and not to Nathan, but to me. Your son Solomon shall succeed me, or literally will rule after. And that's where I could have added in the key words where we find Yimlach here, Akari for after. For Yimlach, the verb for rule would have added even more, especially with Melach is here. So she says, you said it. And then without any pause to let him say, wait a minute, did I or didn't I? Now we have this. As Levine notes below, few, if any, of the scholars who recognize the tendentiousness of Nathan's and Bathsheba's reports concerning Adonijah and Solomon go on to challenge the pair when they claim that David, quote, does not know what is going on in his own realm. Yet the narrator provides no more confirmation of David's ignorance than he does of Adonijah's alleged conspiracy. It is therefore possible that the David of 1 Kings 1 does know about his son's chariots, horsemen, and feast, but finds nothing unsettling about it. It may be that the only thing that David doesn't know is how to see and interpret Adonijah's actions in the same way as do Nathan and Bathsheba. And I think that's a really important point there that many scholars have seen. He goes on to continue. Why would he keep his awareness of events so secret, and why had he not declared a successor or co-regent earlier? The violent deaths of such ancient Near Eastern kings as Amenemhat I and Sennacherib and harem conspiracies suggest an answer. In both cases, the declaration of a younger son to be the successor prompted rival parties in the royal family to engage in disloyal and devious actions that led to the assassination of the reigning king. a premature or precipitous declaration could easily cause the death of both the king and his chosen son. And perhaps Lassine's note there is exactly what's going on and why David is refusing to state anything out loud, that he'd like to live as long as he can live, and he'll live until the next chapter. And that's one view, and it seems to me as good a view as any to make sense of what's going on here. And now suddenly, or literally, and now behold, which the New RSV for no clear reason always leaves out. So we hear, and now behold, Adonijah has become king. Stated as a fact, just like the fact that she seems to state that, yes, you swore by Yahweh your God that Solomon would become king. So it certainly, as she frames it, makes Adonijah sound like he's the rebel against the royal will, and she will add to that in the next verses, we'll see. But before we finish verse 18, let's finish her statement. Adonijah has become king, though you, my lord the king, do not know it. Nathan didn't tell her to say that, and he doesn't repeat that. And does he know it or doesn't he know it? We just explored that. But either way, doesn't this seem like an insult to the king for her to suggest that he's so ignorant of what's going on that one of his sons, against his will, has become king, leading all his other sons to join the party, offering public sacrifice, as we haven't quite heard yet, but certainly inviting many of the people of Judah to join, and he has no idea about it? That would certainly suggest he's either senile or just not paying attention. Either way, it seems like an insult and a dishonor, and yet there she says it. And it's not completely private, since Abishag is there hearing it. But she continues, and he doesn't respond. And as my note has, omitting the invitation to the royal servants of David and the men of Judah, which isn't in our chart here because that's from the narrator. And honestly, we don't know whether she knows about that or not, or she probably does because she's obviously right there in the royal palace, and all those people are being called by Adonijah right from around her. And then she goes on to say what we knew from the narrator, but Nathan hadn't told her, which highlights that she already knew about it when Nathan told her, or at least maybe she's asked elsewhere, but had to be before the scene we see in the green box here, because verse 15 on her left side follows immediately after that, with no sense of Bathsheba investigated or asked some other people. She just went directly in there. So whatever knowledge she had when she went in, highlighting that she was already aware of this whole reality. And she adds the word in abundance here, la rove, and Nathan will repeat it on his side of it, highlighting that Adonijah feels perfectly confident in having a gigantic sacrificial feast. And she goes on to say he's invited all the children of the king, leading Beale to suggest, as you see below, Bathsheba cleverly rearranges the recitation of the guest list so that, quote, all the king's sons, unquote, stand in first position. This must astonish David. Can all his sons be for Adonijah? But as my personal note has below, rearranges in relation to the narrator. This is the first time out loud. So we heard it from the narrator, but she didn't hear it from the narrator. And so she isn't really rearranging anything as far as we can tell. But she is framing it in a certain way, suggesting that all of his sons are rebellious, given her premise that David did swear by Yahweh that Solomon would be the king. And not only all the sons, but the priest Abiathar and Joab, presenting them all as if they're traitors. Only your servant or your slave, Solomon, notice no longer your son, her son. She could say, my son Solomon, which is what she'd said earlier, up here in verse 17, in the parent quote from him, David saying your son. So she could easily have said my son here. She could have said your son Solomon, but she calls him your slave Solomon. It was not called. She also omits what Nathan will add, the non-invitation to Zadok and Benaiah, along with Solomon that we see down here. And so, having stated all that, she turns to her key point here. And as Falkeman notes below, if David makes the proper decision in the here and now concerning the future sitting enthronement, he will then, according to Bathsheba, bring past and future into harmony, which is to say, his promise and his oath before Yahweh and the reality. So she's framed as like a good lawyer, making it sound like there's only one choice for him. And then she continues, but you, my lord the king, the eyes of all Israel are on you to tell them who shall sit. Notice the interesting sensory element. They are watching to hear. But she's highlighting that all Israel, not all Judah. In this sense, is Israel meant to include all the people of Yahweh or just the people of Israel? Is that the point, that the people of Judah don't seem to care and only the people of Israel care? It's ambiguous here on how Israel is understood, so we can't really answer that. to tell them, or literally to announce to them. Lahagid, here, a royal announcement will make it clear. So no more of these backroom discussions, no more conspiracy. She's saying, go out there and announce to everybody who your successor is. Then she frames it, as Beale was saying, with the personal. Otherwise, it will come to pass, and that's not in the Hebrew here. I should go back to my key words here to highlight that. She says, there's no break there. When it comes to pass, otherwise comes to pass is supplied by the New RSV. It simply goes in this order. When my lord the king lies down with his fathers, I and my son Solomon will be offenders. Reversing the wrong order here in the New RSV. This is just wrong. It's not start with my son Solomon and I. It starts with I, and the I is emphatic. So she's speaking to her husband, my lord the king, in this very personal way about her own life. She doesn't say she would die. She said she'd be translated here as offenders, using hataim here, which should be translated as sinners. But as Falkman suggested, as was in his words, a profane political meaning here, which closely approximates the basic sense of the word to fall short, or perhaps to miss the mark. My note below from Genesis 50:17 suggests the parallel with Bathsheba and Solomon are to David as the brothers were to Joseph, in their sense that they thought Joseph was still angry at them and that they needed to apologize to be right with Joseph. Bathsheba doesn't need to apologize, but if it is that Solomon isn't made king, then the people on Adonijah's side will see her as sinners for violating. But will that mean they'll be killed? She never raises that question, and it's interesting that Nathan made it the point, it's not in the instructions, but say these things so that you may live, save your life, and save the life of your son, and yet neither of them bring that question up. It seems to be enough implied, and they don't need to say to the man in front of them, you're going to kill us if Adonijah becomes king, or Adonijah will kill us, your son will kill your wife. And so that's all left there, and just as Bathsheba listened to Nathan without responding, now David has listened to Bathsheba without responding, and Nathan will come right in and David still won't respond. But he will respond after Nathan's speech, what we'll see next time. See you then.